For 30 years he never did it. Not once. Johnny Carson, the man who controlled American late-night television with a smile and a perfectly timed joke, had an unwritten rule: the show goes on. No matter what happened behind that curtain, no matter what was said or felt, the audience got their entertainment. The band played. The guests laughed. The cameras rolled. But on this particular Thursday night in 1983, something broke. Carson stood up from his desk. The cue card in his hand fluttered to the floor. The studio audience, 200 people who had come expecting jokes and celebrity small talk, went completely silent. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet mid-note. Ed McMahon's signature laugh died in his throat. Because Bette Davis, Hollywood royalty, the woman who had stared down moguls and dominated the silver screen for 5 decades, had just said something that stripped away every layer of performance in that room. And Johnny Carson, for the first time in 3 decades of broadcasting, stopped being a host. He became just a man, standing across from another human being who needed him to be exactly that. How did we get here? The evening had started like any other Tonight Show taping. The familiar rainbow curtain glowed under studio lights. The audience filed in, buzzing with anticipation. Johnny sat at his desk, flipping through note cards, his expression focused but relaxed. He'd interviewed thousands of guests. This was routine. Bette Davis was scheduled as the second guest. At 75 years old, she was a living legend, but her health had been declining. Word had quietly circulated through NBC that she was battling cancer, though she refused to discuss it publicly. Her agent had called ahead: "Keep it light, keep it short, don't press." Johnny nodded when the producer briefed him. He understood. He always understood. The monologue went smoothly. Laughs landed where they should. The first guest, a comedian promoting a new film, delivered exactly what was expected. Then came the commercial break. Backstage, Bette Davis sat in the green room, staring at her reflection. Her makeup artist had done remarkable work, but beneath the foundation, she looked tired. Not the exhaustion of a long day. The kind of tired that settles into bones when the fight becomes too heavy to carry alone. A production assistant knocked softly. "Miss Davis, you're up in 2 minutes." She nodded, standing slowly. Her hand trembled slightly as she smoothed her dress. She'd worn her favorite pearls. The ones her daughter had given her years ago, back when things between them were still simple. Back before fame and ego and all the noise had gotten in the way. The band struck up as Ed McMahon announced her name. The audience erupted. Bette walked onto that stage the way she'd walked onto 1,000 stages before, head high, smile practiced, every inch the icon. Johnny rose from his desk to greet her. They shook hands. She settled into the guest chair. The cameras captured it all in warm, golden light. "Bette Davis, it's wonderful to have you here," Johnny said, his voice carrying that trademark mix of respect and warmth. "Thank you, Johnny. It's good to be here." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Something fragile. They talked about her new project, a television movie. She answered his questions with her usual sharp wit. The audience laughed. Everything was going according to script. Then Johnny asked a simple question. The kind of question he'd asked 100 times before. "What's it like, after all these years in this business, to look back on everything you've accomplished?" Bette paused. Her hand went to her pearls, fingers worrying the smooth surface. For a moment, she seemed to look past the cameras, past the lights, into some private distance only she could see. "You know, Johnny," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about that a lot lately." The studio fell into a different kind of silence. Not the anticipatory hush before a punchline. Something deeper. "I spent 50 years fighting to be taken seriously. Fighting for roles. Fighting against the studio system. Fighting to prove I was more than just another pretty face they could control." Her voice cracked slightly. "And I won a lot of those fights. 2 Oscars. Roles that mattered. Respect from people whose respect actually meant something." Johnny leaned forward, his usual interviewer's posture shifting into something more intimate. The cue cards in his hand lowered. But somewhere in all that fighting, Bette continued, her eyes beginning to glisten, I forgot to just be with the people who loved me. My daughter. My friends. The people who didn't care about Bette Davis the icon. They just wanted Bette. The person. A single tear traced down her cheek, cutting through the carefully applied makeup. And now I'm 75 years old, and I'm sick, Johnny. I'm really sick. And all I want is more time. Not to make another film. Not to win another award. Just time to sit with my daughter and tell her I'm sorry for all the years I chose my career over her. The audience had gone so still that the hum of the studio lights became audible. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't promotional material. This was a woman, at the end of her life, breaking open in front of millions of people. And Johnny Carson, the consummate professional who never let emotion derail the show, made a choice. He stood up from his desk. The movement was so unexpected that the cameras momentarily lost focus, unsure where to point. Ed McMahon's eyes widened. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet completely, watching. Johnny walked around the desk, his usual quick strides slowed to something deliberate. He crossed the space between host and guest, between performer and person, and he sat down on the edge of the coffee table directly in front of Bette Davis. He reached out and took her hand in both of his. "Bette," he said, and his voice had none of the performance left in it. No timing. No setup for a joke. Just human warmth. "Have you told her? Your daughter. Have you told her what you just told me?" Bette shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "I don't know if she'd even take my call, Johnny. I wasn't a good mother. I was too busy being Bette Davis." Johnny squeezed her hand gently. The cameras were still rolling, but he wasn't aware of them anymore. Neither was she. 200 people in that studio audience weren't watching a show. They were witnessing something raw and true. "Then call her tonight," Johnny said quietly. "The moment you leave this studio, you call her. And you tell her exactly what you just told all of us. Because I promise you, Bette, she needs to hear it. And you need to say it." Bette looked at him, this man she'd known through the filter of celebrity and television, and she saw genuine care in his eyes. "You really think she'd listen?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I know she would," Johnny said. "Because what parent doesn't want to hear that they mattered? That they were loved? Even if it's complicated. Even if it's late. It's never too late to say it." The audience remained silent, but you could feel the emotional weight in the air, thick and present. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. In the control room, the director was frantically signaling to cut to commercial. This was too raw. Too real. Network television in 1983 didn't do moments like this. But Johnny's producer, a man who'd worked with him for 15 years, held up his hand. "Let it play," he said quietly. Because he understood what was happening. This wasn't just good television. This was important. Back on stage, Johnny still held Bette's hand. He looked directly into her eyes and said something the microphones barely caught but the camera captured in the movement of his lips. "You're going to be okay." It wasn't a promise about her health. It was something deeper. An acknowledgement that even at the end, even with regrets, there was still grace available. Still connection to be found. Bette nodded, wiping her eyes with her free hand. She managed a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Johnny. I mean that." He smiled back, and it was the warmest expression anyone in that studio had ever seen on his face during a broadcast. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Johnny stood, but before returning to his desk, he did something else completely off script. He gestured to Doc Severinsen. The bandleader understood immediately. The orchestra began to play, but not the usual upbeat transition music. Something soft. Something that held space for what had just happened. The audience, as if released from a spell, began to applaud. Not the enthusiastic clapping of entertainment. Something slower, deeper. A standing ovation built not from excitement but from shared humanity. Bette stood as well, and Johnny walked her off stage himself, his hand gently on her back, the way you'd guide someone you truly cared about. When he returned to his desk, the cue card was still on the floor where he dropped it. He bent down, picked it up, looked at it for a moment, then set it aside. "We'll be right back," he said to the camera. His voice carried a weight it hadn't at the start of the show. During the commercial break, nobody spoke. The studio crew stood in their positions, but there was a collective processing happening. What they just witnessed hadn't been part of the job description. Johnny sat at his desk, his hands folded. Ed McMahon approached cautiously. "Johnny, that was—" "I know," Johnny said quietly. He looked toward the curtain where Bette had exited. "I hope she makes that call." But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. 3 days later, a small envelope arrived at NBC addressed to Johnny Carson. Inside was a handwritten note on elegant stationery. "Dear Johnny, I called her. We talked for 3 hours. She's coming to visit me next week. You gave me a gift I didn't know I could still receive, a second chance. Thank you for seeing me. Not Bette Davis the actress. Just Bette. With deepest gratitude. BD." Johnny read the note in his office before the taping that night. His producer found him there, staring at the paper. "Good news?" the producer asked. Johnny folded the note carefully. "The best kind." He never mentioned the note on air. He didn't frame it or make it part of his legacy. He simply tucked it into his desk drawer, where it stayed for the rest of his career at The Tonight Show. But word spread among the staff. The story of what happened that Thursday night became part of the show's lore. Young production assistants were told about it. New writers heard the tale. It became a touchstone for what the show could be at its best, not just entertainment, but a place where real human connection could happen. Years later, after Johnny Carson retired, journalists would occasionally ask him about memorable moments from his 30 years hosting. He'd mention the famous episodes, the exotic animals, the comedy sketches, the A-list guests. But if you pressed him, if you asked about the moments that truly mattered, he'd grow quieter. And sometimes, if the interviewer had earned his trust, he'd mention Bette Davis. "She taught me something that night," he said once in a rare reflective interview. "That all the timing and all the jokes and all the performance, it matters. It's what people tune in for." But if you're not willing to drop all of that when a real human moment appears, then what are you really doing? Entertaining people is important. But connecting with them? That's something else entirely. The interviewer asked if he ever heard from Bette's daughter. Johnny smiled, a genuine warmth crossing his face. "I got a Christmas card from her for years after that. Always signed with thanks for giving my mother back to me, even if just for a little while." Bette Davis passed away 6 years after that Tonight Show appearance. In her final interview, given just months before her death, she was asked about her proudest moment in Hollywood. She didn't mention all about Eve. She didn't talk about her Oscars. "There was a night on The Tonight Show," she said softly, "when I stopped pretending to be strong and just admitted I was scared. And Johnny Carson, instead of moving on to the next joke, stopped the show and held my hand. That night, I learned it was okay to be human. Even after 50 years of being a legend." The interviewer asked what happened after that. Bette's eyes filled with tears, but they were different from the ones she'd shed on that stage. These were tears of gratitude. "I called my daughter. We reconciled. She was with me at the end." A pause. "Johnny Carson gave me that. Not through anything he said on camera, but through what he did when the cameras didn't matter anymore." The cue card that Johnny had dropped that night was never used again. A production assistant retrieved it after the taping, thinking it was trash. But when she looked at what was written on it, she paused. It was the standard prompt for transitioning to commercial. "And we'll be right back after this." She brought it to Johnny's producer, thinking it might be sentimental. The producer smiled and took it to Johnny's office. Johnny looked at it for a long moment, then placed it in a small frame on the shelf behind his desk. Not for display. Just for him. Because that card marked the moment he learned the most important lesson of his career. Sometimes the greatest thing you can do for someone isn't to make them laugh. It's to let them cry. And to stay with them while they do. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten.